Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. A really interesting conversation with Simon Meisch this week. Simon works at the Department of Ethics and Education at the University of Tubingen in Germany, and until recently was also a visiting scholar here at IDEA. It's an unusual episode of the podcast in that we aren't talking about a specific ethical issue for the most part. Instead, we talk about a particular way of highlighting ethical issues and encouraging discussion of them. That's through engaging with serial narratives, including comic books and TV series. And we focused on one particular comic book series which has been adapted for TV, which is called Heartstopper. Aside from enlightening me about that series, Simon makes a convincing case that this is a good way to get at a range of ethical issues, in a way that's complex, subtle, and grounded in recognisable situations. Welcome to the podcast, Simon.
Thanks for inviting me. Good to be here.
Great. So we're going to talk about something that's fairly unusual, I suppose, for philosophers. We're going to talk about non-traditional approaches to teaching ethics, but in particular, we're going to talk about using comic books as a resource in teaching ethics and in thinking about ethics, I suppose, more generally. And one particular series of comics that you're particularly interested in is the Heartstopper series. So we're going to talk about that series in particular as well. But I wondered if you could begin by just telling me a bit about your background as an ethicist and why you became interested in using these non-traditional approaches to teaching and thinking about ethics.
So I'm a senior lecturer for interdisciplinary ethics at the Ethics Center at the University of Tubingen. So most of my teaching, most of my teaching is for non-philosophers. Yeah. So, and also it's not only non-philosopher, but also very heterogeneous groups. So some of my teaching goes to the politics students. Another part of my teaching goes to a specific study program in sustainable development. And most of my teaching is for teacher training students. What my colleagues and I do is we try to support their ethical competence with regard to their study subject or with regard to topics that might arise in school.
Yeah.
And so what we want to do is help them recognize ethical problems in first place and why they are ethical problems, and give them some advice how to approach those issues.
Cool.
And as I said, most of my students are teacher training students. So what I do is I give a class in an elective, so everybody can come. So the only thing that unites them is that they're teacher training students.
Right.
So there will. I have had classes when there was a maths sports student and a Russian English student all in the same class. So you need to find a common ground for students who have very different skills.
Yes.
And different ideas of what it means to study and learn. That's really, really different from people with a scientific background compared to someone coming from sports, for example.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, so that teaching philosophy to students of other disciplines is something that we do here at IDEA, right, as well. Yeah. And you're a visiting scholar here in IDEA at the moment, working with us. So it's good to talk to you about this stuff. So I suppose when you're working with people who have, as you say, very heterogeneous backgrounds and might never really have studied philosophy before, kind of coming in with some classic philosophical text or something is likely to put people off, just be too difficult, and not be a helpful way of approaching things, right?
Yes, definitely. So in a way, my approach is that I cannot reasonably expect them to have the traditional skills from the humanities. So reading long philosophical texts, writing reflection papers. Really, for students from scientific backgrounds, they do a reflection paper for the first time when they come to our classes. So it would also be the only time they do it.
Yeah.
So the traditional skills and tasks you have in philosophy classes, you cannot expect that from them. So not reading long texts, as I said, not writing reflection papers, or even discussing contested stuff in classes. They don't do.
Right.
Usually don't do.
So discussing contested stuff like difficult topics where people might have differences of opinion.
Yeah. So I had this discussion the other day with a didactics person from chemistry, and he said, we really want to engage our students in discussion, for example, on pesticides, which is a topic that would arise in chemistry. But it's really hard for them to start this discussion.
Right.
So for the students, but also for people from the chemistry department to make them discuss. So it's also a question of high school didactics. How can I approach this question with my students?
Yeah.
So I have all those students in my class. So people from the language departments who really like to talk, and people from the science department who really don't like. But but then again, they really feel they have a space when they can do that for the first time.
Yeah.
So they're open to it, but not familiar with it. And so I have to find, as I said, a common ground for all of them to talk about ethics. That was basically my starting point to think about non-traditional ways of doing it.
Yes.
So I'm not against the traditional ways. If you teach philosophy to philosophers, go for it.
Yeah.
But I just feel in a heterogeneous group, you can't do it.
Yeah, great. And one of the non-traditional approaches that you've been taking is to base discussions on serial narrations. So kind of, I suppose, there are all sorts of serial narrations, aren't there? But two examples would be TV programs and comic books.
Yes.
Right. So what is it that's particularly useful about serial narrations, or what is it that makes it a good way of starting those conversations about ethics?
Good question. Let me take a step back. In a way, we always use narrations in ethics. So, for example, if we, when dealing with some issue in applied ethics, we usually deal with people who tell us their problems in a narrative way, and we as ethicists try to untangle those problems and find the ethical content.
Right.
And we also, and that's how we humans work. We have a problem and we tell it in a narrative way.
Yeah.
So as ethicists, I believe we are always used to deal with narratives. And also that the way narratives are framed structures the content of the ethical problem. So, for example, if you deal with a specific societal problems, you would invite many stakeholders to get a lot of narratives to understand the problem better.
Yeah.
So, in a way, we are used to work with narratives. And then we are also used to work with narratives in our teaching. So, for example, we use case studies. They might be aesthetically poor, but there's still a narrative, or like dilemma situations. For example, the trolley problem is a narrative. So you're standing at a switch and you see the trolley coming, and you can turn the switch. No, is it the switch you turn? No, what do you turn?
I think it's a switch. Yeah,
it's a switch you turn.
Yeah.
And either you kill one person or you kill 5 persons. So it's a narrative about the problems of specific philosophical theories. And what students really learn fast is that the way you frame a narrative also structures the problem, because they will come up with a lot of real-world solutions how to deal with the trolley problem. For example, shouting to the workers, "Go away! There's a trolley coming," or something like this. And we exclude it because we want to have the narrative in a specific way.
Yes.
So narratives are part of ethics teaching. Also, a lot of people like to use literary texts from the classical canon to discuss ethical problems. Take Crime and Punishment from Dostoevsky when you want to discuss free will. Or if you want to discuss issues of political philosophy, you could take Sophocles' Antigone. So we also have been using narratives in ethics teaching. Yeah, but your question was specifically...
It was about serial narratives, right? So you're using comic books and TV programs as well. So there's something slightly different about those narratives, isn't there? I mean, I guess like historically, a lot of fiction has been absorbed in a serial way. So think about like Charles Dickens used to serialize all his works, and they were written as serials and then only later collected into books.
Yes.
But is there something that's particularly helpful about that kind of approach to fiction?
Again, I have a pragmatic answer, which is the serial narratives. You mentioned comics, TV series. Those are the narratives my students would know, or students do know. And so they're more easily accessible to them. And they're really wonderful comics or graphic novel. For example, I used the Sandman comics from Neil Gaiman, and they're perfect if you want to discuss issues of science and society, power, gender, and so on. My students always complain because there's an age restriction on it, so they can't use it in school because usually they are 17, I think.
Oh, is that right?
But I think you ask for the format itself. And for example, what you can do is, you mentioned those old serial narrations. They, for example, invented this idea of the cliffhanger.
Yes.
So, for example, you have a cliffhanger and then you have to wait for another week or even a month, so depending on the format. And for example, Breaking Bad is a good example. Because in a way, we hope that Walter White or Jesse Pinkman get away with what they're doing, basically selling drugs or killing people.
Yeah.
Even so, we know that's morally wrong. So we could ask ourselves, so we could discuss the stuff they're doing from a philosophical perspective, but we could also discuss what the format does in bending our moral intuitions.
Right,
so,
yeah.
Or not bending, but, we know that the police should capture them and put them in jail because what they do is wrong. But that's actually not what we are hoping for.
No, I mean, so some of these questions are actually about fiction and about the way we engage with fiction, right? So it's not necessarily just about the story that's being told, but it's like, why are we rooting for these people who are obviously really bad people? And does that say something bad about our own moral character, or is there something kind of complex going on? Which,
or what kind of ethical background knowledge do we have? So we adapt our moral intuition to fiction. Because we want them to get away. Even so, we usually don't want drug dealers to get away. And there's also, for example, Umberto Eco, the author of The Name of the Rose. He wrote a lot on series and comics.
Okay.
And he is quite interested in the dynamics between repetition and innovation that you have in serial narrations. And what he used is Superman. Because Superman basically lives the same story again and again and again and again. He always saves the world.
Yes.
But so there's a repetition that does something to the expectations of readers. And then again, you need innovation because otherwise it would get too boring. And you can discuss what ethical assumptions are there for us. So why do we need those repetitions? And what's in there for us when there's an innovation? So to see the world could always be different, for example, and so on. Or there's also a Swiss literary scholar, Elisabeth Bronfen, and what she does is study the works of Shakespeare.
Right.
And in particular, those constellations in his works that come up again and again and again. For example, cross-dressing of women, so women dressing as men. And what she does is serial reading. So she takes those scenes and puts them next to each other just to study what the repetition does for our understanding of power relations, of gender relations, and to see how there could be always alternatives to a specific constellation.
Right.
And what ethical questions arise from there. So this would be a very explicit way of using serial reading for philosophical discussion.
Yes, I see, yeah. It makes me think about sitcoms as well. So that's an interesting form, right? And typically what happens in sitcoms is you've got a set of characters, and those characters might change somewhat over a very long period of time, but basically at the end of the sitcom, everything's reset.
Yes.
And at the beginning of the next episode, we're back where we started.
Yes.
Right. And there's something about the way that works in comedy specifically, right? Because you've got characters who are perhaps kind of trying to transcend their circumstances, but always being pulled back.
Yes.
And that's kind of, that kind of makes for comedy.
Yeah, and if you have a good class, you can really work out those issues and discuss them with students. Yeah, and they really like it because that's the way they recept the world in a way.
Yes, good. Yeah, I can see that. Great. And what about comic book series in particular? So what's distinctive about comic books, I suppose, is that they combine visual and verbal, literary kind of content, right?
Yes.
And so is there something interesting about the way they work that makes them well suited to this kind of activity?
Yeah, you mentioned it. It's the graphic element because they allow for low threshold entry into philosophical discussions. So obviously you have to choose as a lecturer a specific panel or strip, and then you just use PowerPoint and let them describe what they see. And even those students who do not feel confident about talking on philosophical issues, they can describe what they see, and then they can react to it. And suddenly you realize you get into a discussion on what is in there and start talking about or start approaching the ethical or philosophical content of this scene. So it's a really low threshold entry into discussions.
Right. And I guess there's quite a lot of information in comics, which is quite compressed and is quite easy to convey. So like you say, you could have a kind of 3 or 5 panel strip, which is going to include as much information as you might get from a few paragraphs of text, right? So it's very simple and easy for people to grasp hold of, but it might be kind of internally very complex and rich.
Yes. And you can also, in a way, manipulate the strip by blacking out text and let them guess how the scene would continue or what a person would say.
Right.
And then we could discuss why they would assume the person acts in a specific way. And then we could talk about moral intuitions, and then we are easily approaching ethical content.
Great. And one comic book series that you're particularly interested in is this series Heartstopper. So I must admit, I'd never heard of Heartstopper before you mentioned it. I like comics, but I don't spend as long as maybe I could do reading them. And Heartstopper was one that was unfamiliar to me. So could you tell me a bit about Heartstopper, what it is and why is it interesting?
Maybe it's not targeted to our generation.
Possibly.
Heartstopper it started as a online comic written and drawn by Alice Oseman, and it got hugely popular and then was published as books, and you also mentioned there's a TV series. It's also interesting from a media perspective how such phenomena evolve. But you ask for content. So basically it's about 2 boys, Charlie Spring and Nick Nelson, who are the same school, they're 1 year apart, and they fall in love. And you, as a reader, follow how they develop into a couple and as a couple over now 6 books, I believe. 5 or 6 books.
Yeah.
And you also learn about the struggles they have in becoming a couple, but also about problems on the way. So Charlie has mental issues. Nick has problems, family issues. You also learn about how they're in school life in a British school, and problems that arise from there. But also about their friends who are, or you could say it's a group of queer friends. And so you follow their lives through 2 or 3 school years.
Right, okay, great. You mentioned that Heartstopper is, as well as being a comic book series, it's a TV series. Is it on Netflix? Is that
It's
right?
on Netflix.
So are you interested in both of those? Or is it just a comic book series that you think people should focus on?
It's a question of taste. I do not like the TV series particularly, but I'm pragmatic in 2 ways. So I did research on Heartstopper and so on, and how it relates to philosophy of love, sex, and relationship. And we'll do that as a seminar next winter term in Tübingen.
Okay.
And I will start with the comic because, as we already discussed, this has specific challenges. The comic as a comic format. But as I said, I'm pragmatic. People really, really like the TV show.
Yes.
So I will also check if and how I can use the scenes I identified from the comic, if I also can use the scenes from the TV show.
Right, yeah.
That's so pragmatic in the sense people like it, so I use it. But also there's also a downside because, and that's a really problem if you do teaching with TV series, most often they are on streaming platforms. And obviously people need access to those streaming platforms. Right. So it's easier to buy the comics and have them in the library, but I cannot buy via our library a Netflix subscription.
Yes.
So I don't want to exclude students from having access to the teaching material.
Yeah, okay, no, that makes sense.
The comics are really beautifully drawn. So it's really, I would recommend to start with the comic. I feel that I don't understand a lot of changes they made for the TV show. And they added to a low drama graphic novel a bit of sex education. I don't know do you know the Netflix show Sex Education?
I've not seen it, but I'm aware of it.
Yeah, so it feels like they added sex education, which is also a really, really nice series, and I can recommend it. But it changed a bit the tone and the character of the story. Okay. Which I don't like, but as I said, people really, really, really like the TV show, so I'm not giving advice against it.
Okay, great. All right. So what are the kind of ethical questions then that Heartstopper raises? What sorts of general, I think you've mentioned kind of questions to do with the ethics of love, sex and relationship. Yes. So is that kind of what you're interested in and what the kinds of questions that it raises?
Yes, I think that's the core of my interest in Heartstopper. So the book raises ethical issues about love, sex and relationship, but also in a way that is interesting for people of all sexual identities. Because I said it's about a queer couple, but the questions that come up are, the philosophical and ethical questions that come up are also interesting and relevant for non-gay.
Yes, okay, right.
So it's about those two boys who fall in love, the friendship group, which involves people of other sexual identities. So it raises a lot of LGBTQI plus topics. And for me, that's interesting because a lot of school subjects, at least in Germany, in the region where I live, those topics relate to at least 5 to 10 school subjects. So it's really also really relevant for my teacher training students.
Ah, yes, okay. Yeah, good.
So it's about love, sex and relationship, sexual identities, different forms of romantic life. So what it needs to have flourishing romantic lives. And I think the comic really, really nicely takes up those topics, and I wouldn't say they discuss it because it's a narration, but narrates it in a really interesting way, in a productive way. And I know from conversations with my students that they really like the comics, but also the TV show, because the Osman and the comics provided them with a language to self-identify, because she also narrates it in a really respectful way. So it was really helpful, at least that's what my students tell me, it was really helpful for them to self-identify romantically. But there are also other interesting questions. For example, how figuring out one's sexual identity is a question of epistemic justice is a really interesting topic that comes up.
Okay, could you say a bit more about that? So just for our listeners' sake, what do you mean by epistemic injustice and how does that come up in there?
So basically, epistemic justice or injustice is about justice issues that arise with regard to knowing, to the process of knowing. Wanting to know about your romantic life and sexual identity is a really relevant and crucial part for your life. And we know that from different philosophical theories like the capabilities approach of Nussbaum, where like the capability to have control over sexual identity and is really important for a flourishing life.
Right.
So those are really important questions when it comes to how we can have flourishing lives. And quite often, the dominant narrative in societies makes it difficult for people who do not feel that they conform with what is considered normal.
Yes.
So obviously they have a way or a need, but also they need to find ways of knowing about themselves and how there are like barriers, social narratives about what is a good romantic life that makes it difficult for them.
Yes.
And the comic is quite often about how people need the time, the space to figure out and know better about themselves.
Yes, good. Yeah.
I know that was a long sentences, but
yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I can imagine that using comic books for those kind of questions in particular might be particularly useful, I suppose, because there's a way in which kind of a narrative depiction of people who are struggling with those kinds of pressures and those kinds of, well, you know, societal expectations and so on, just brings home what that means in a way that talking about those things in the abstract doesn't, right?
Yes.
So you could say, you know, there is a kind of normative expectation within society that relationships take a particular form, and some people struggle with that. And, you know, many people would see what you meant, but actually showing that over a period of time, showing some characters actually navigating those difficult situations really brings that to life in a way that must be particularly helpful, I think.
Yes, and also there are scenes where this particular issue is explicitly raised. For example, when some people tell other people they don't have a right to know what is your sexual identity.
Yes.
So you don't owe it to them. So as soon as you know that you don't fulfill the normal expectations, let's put it like this, you have to tell immediately. And then they say, no, you don't have to tell it. You don't owe it to them.
Yeah.
Find out first. And when you feel confident, then tell people if you want to. So it's basically gaining the control over one's own romantic narrative in a way. And how that is, and what kind of expectations you have to fulfill or obligations you have or not have. And the comic really explicitly talks about this. So there are really panels that you can just take and discuss really deep philosophical stuff.
Right, that's really interesting. Do you find that people have kind of different views on these things? So when you're having these discussions in classes, are people kind of broadly in agreement about what the right position to take on these things in, or do you sometimes have disputes and disagreements between people?
That is really hard to tell, because I believe I have already some selection bias. So people who wouldn't like to discuss that kind of stuff wouldn't probably come to my class.
Yes.
So the people who come, they feel confident discussing that. So I once had a class and I was really moved by how respectful they could discuss with each other over sexual content and other content that is usually highly disputed within society.
Yes.
So I feel the people who come to these classes feel confident to discuss those ethical issues in a respectful way. Yeah,
good. And again, I suppose having a kind of narrative to base the discussions on maybe helps in that respect as well, because I suppose people aren't sort of talking about, I mean, potentially, well, I guess they potentially in some cases are talking about each other's identities, but the focus of it is this kind of fictional set of scenarios, so it maybe slightly depersonalizes it to an extent.
Yes, and also what I agree, and I also go a step further. So we have like this seminar structure where students are invited to give some presentations. So it's not like a lecturing or tutoring. It's more like a discussion-based, presentation-based kind of seminar.
Right, okay.
And I asked them not to present a specific topic, but to present an idea how they would teach this topic to their pupils or their future pupils, and do this specific idea with their colleagues in class. And so in the end, it is a kind of presentation, but also in mind that this will be targeted to pupils. And then it's again one step further away from their personal experience.
Yeah.
So it's not only they don't only discuss a comic, but also a teaching idea.
Yeah, okay. Can you give some examples maybe from Heartstopper of storylines that raise complex ethical questions so that we can kind of see how these discussions might play out and how there might be a particular advantage to thinking about, stories from a comic book?
Yes, there's one interesting issue that is, as I mentioned before, is like how romantic relationships evolved and how people are falling in love, and how people who are falling in love and beginning a relationship interact with each other. And in the book series, we, as I said, follow Nick and Charlie in their relationship, and we see how they struggle with certain steps you usually have in your relationship. And at some point they realize, they have like a revelation. They realize they have made another step.
Right.
So they discuss, are they together or are they not together? Would they say I love you or wouldn't they say I love you? Would they have sex or not? And so on and so on and so on. Then and every time this revelation emerges, or they realize they've made a further step, there's like this, I wouldn't say iconic sentence, but why are we like this? And what you could do, for example, in a class is like put those scenes next to each other and see how romantic life evolves, how issues of consent, trust, being vulnerable, obligations to each other emerge from those steps. What it means to negotiate a flourishing relationship. Those are really interesting ethical questions you could do, like and using the specific format of a series.
Yeah, okay.
So what you use the series, but also you use serial reading that I mentioned before to study those philosophical issues about flourishing romantic relationships. But also there's another issue which I really find interesting, is about forgiveness. So you have a couple of scenes where people ask for forgiveness, and sometimes people forgive and sometimes they don't. And then you can engage students in a discussion on, but what does forgiveness mean? Do we have a right to be forgiven, or do we have an obligation to forgive? And under what circumstances?
Yeah.
You can talk about blame and guilt. So there are a lot of issues that you can, ethical issues that you can discuss with those scenes. So it's not only about love, sex, and relationship, but also about other issues such as forgiveness or bullying. So bullying is a huge topic. Obviously, we know bullying is wrong, but why is it wrong? And then you can engage students in discussions about that.
Yeah. Okay. It sounds absolutely fascinating. I think we might be slightly running out of time, though. So are there any other storylines from Heartstopper or really interesting issues that you wanted to mention that you just think it's very good at illustrating?
I believe Heartstopper is really interesting because it is targeted for a younger generation and addresses issues of love, sex, and relationship, what it means to have flourishing romantic life for this audience, which is actually our students, and we find something that interests them. But what I also find interesting is if you take a critical. So now I always discuss taking the comic as a good way of illustrating stuff. We could also use it in a critical way. So, for example, Nick and Charlie are going to become like soulmates. And that you can critically discuss. So does it put too much? So if those two are our models, of a flourishing romantic life, and they are presented as such, does that put too much pressure on people to find the one partner?
Yeah.
And if you don't find them, you will always be lost.
Yeah.
So you could also just use it to critically engage with the narrative.
Yeah.
So that's also I wanted to mention that you can also, you don't only have to use it in an affirmative way, but also in a critical way to say, how is romantic life here depicted?
That's interesting. I'd actually want just one question, which I don't know whether you'd have an answer for, but I'll ask it anyway, just to see what you say. Is there an interesting sort of generational element to this? So as you've said, kind of this comic series is aimed, I suppose, at teenagers or kind of young adults, right?
Young adults. Yeah.
And we're from a sort of slightly older generation.
Yes.
I wonder if there's kind of, have you found that engaging with this comic series has sort of taught you something about the different ways in which young people today might be engaging with these questions of kind of romantic agency and so on compared to people from earlier generations? That's
interesting because the comic does raise this issue explicitly.
Oh, right.
Because there are two teachers, two men, who also are going to become a couple, and they discuss it, how it was different when they were young and how it was more difficult to find out about oneself's identity and all the restrictions on all the expectations there were at that time.
Right.
So the comic actually discusses this generation gap, and I feel it implies that for younger people now it is more normal.
Yeah, perhaps like there's a vocabulary that's available now that wasn't available previously, right?
Yeah.
So you can articulate things in a slightly more nuanced way, I suppose.
And I feel actually those comics make a really, really good job in providing the language.
Right.
So,
Cool, that's really interesting.
What I found interesting, not from a generational gap, but from like a cross-cultural gap.
Yeah.
Because those, Nick and Charlie, at least from the comic, are the Fridays for Future generation.
Oh.
And like environmental issue are completely absent from the comics. That was something that I realized because this would have been the generation who would have gone on demonstrating every Friday, and those topics are completely absent. And
Right, okay. One more question then. You're here on a visiting scholarship, so you're going to be thinking about, so actually that Heartstopper is going to be a big part of the focus of what your work is going to be, right, over the next, how long is it?
Actually, it's almost ending.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. But what I did is I wanted to use the time to basically take a time out to think about how to relate Heartstopper to the philosophy of love, sex, and relationship in a way that also appeals to people who do not self-identify as queer.
Okay.
Because I believe that the topics raised there are also interesting for all pupils. And that was a bit my aim when I came here, to find the philosophical language to underscore this intuition.
Yeah. Okay.
And what I did is prepare a class that I will give in the winter term in Tübingen, and find the literature and discuss with the people from the Center for Love, Sex and Relationship. So in that way, it was successful. I have finished so I have the curriculum now for this class. And so it was a really successful stay here in Leeds.
I'm very glad to hear it. Okay, well, that's all we got time for. So Simon Meisch, thank you very much for being on the podcast.
Thank you for being here. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes, and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.